Look, seatbelts are pretty cool, mitigating that pesky momentum, but I shudder to think about how many hours of my life have been spent putting on my seatbelt before going for a drive, not to mention the time spent taking it off. Consider every time you've set foot in a car and multiply that by 3 to 10 seconds, depending on how fat you are. Yeah, that's a lot of time spent doing something far from rewarding, discounting the preservation of one's life. There has to be a better way, though. A way to retain one's position behind the windscreen without having to go through the hassle of putting on a seatbelt. I pondered this dilemma for a while, arriving on a handful of far from suitable alternatives. One such consideration was using superglue or some other industrial adhesive to glue myself to the driver's seat, but I do like the idea of walking, sleeping in a bed, or otherwise retaining my mobility beyond the confines of a motor vehicle. Probably takes longer than putting on a seatbelt too, defeating the whole purpose of the exercise. For a time, I feared that I would be forever doomed to spending a few more seconds putting on my seatbelt every time I needed to drive somewhere. But then I surmised an idea so brilliant that I may be a fool for sharing it rather than seeking a patent for it. But I am a generous man, so here is my really great idea. Metal seats and magnetic pants. Think about it, you're probably going to be wearing pants, probably, so why not get dressed and ready to drive at the same time? The minor inconveniences of sitting on a metal seat on a hot day or alternatively a cold day pale in comparison to the sheer utility of shaving a few seconds off your daily commute. I mean, might also be difficult to get out of the Good more after Eve night, Cosmoronic number 16. I'm Fringin', I hope you're all doing well. This is the end of the obligatory beginning of the episode complaining about Obi-Wan Kenobi. It's done. It's finished. It's over. I never have to think about it again. Though it may still haunt me in my nightmares. You guys may remember that some episodes ago, I talked about what I perceive to be the challenges of writing a prequel, that there are a lot of pitfalls that you can easily fall into while writing a prequel. You're just more confined than when you're writing a totally original story, and in some sense, even sequels give you a little bit more freedom. I guess if we look at narratives from the perspective that we're kind of forward-looking, when you write a sequel, you're thinking about what's to come, and that's still ill-defined. That can be essentially whatever you make it, as long as you can justify it enough in the story. Whereas when you're writing a prequel, it has to lead to a place that is already set in stone. There's just less options at your disposal with regard to how it will end. And you need to account for that. If you don't account for that, you end up writing a story that doesn't really fit into the timeline in which it's set all that well. And I discussed how, with Obi-Wan Kenobi, there is a lot of potential there for certain types of stories, but all of those stories would need to be pretty low stakes. They would need to see Obi-Wan stay on Tatooine, not get into too much trouble, because it would seem that he's managed to stay totally under the radar in the 19 years between Revenge of the Sith and A New Hope. We need to leave him in that place without totally changing our understanding of why he is in that place. I think that's a challenge that is, I don't know if I want to say often, but sometimes poorly navigated. I think when writing prequels, there seems to be an urge to explain every line to make the interactions between a pair of characters a lot more significant than they may have originally been intended to be. And that can work. That can work. That's probably the important part of that sentence. It can, provisionally, maybe, depending on how well you craft your story. Why am I saying all this? Oh, well, it's because the show is really, I don't like it. I really don't like it. And it would seem that this is a minority perspective for now, but give it 2 or 3 months and I think the tide will turn. It's become very difficult to ignore that trend. Whenever a new Disney film or show releases, it receives copious praise at release. But give or take a few months, the general consensus sours. Then people start to realize, oh, maybe it wasn't that good. Remember Moon Knight? Remember all the praise Moon Knight was getting? Best Marvel series yet. Really great story that they're telling here. Now what's the perspective? Oh, Moon Knight was like mid at best and it really wasted the potential of that character. Doctor Strange got a lot of praise when it came out. Now the sentiment is definitely... That film's only been out for what, 2 months? And the sentiment is already completely soured. You're not gonna find many people who will tell you that that film is well written anymore, when those people were pretty plentiful when the film came out. And now we're here with Obi-Wan Kenobi. Copious praise. People seem to adore the finale. I wouldn't be surprised if in 2 or 3 months people will start saying that was a pretty lame choice that they made there, or, they kind of didn't tell the best story that they could have told with this character. Actually, this does cause problems with continuity. Just give it time. It's just frustrating that this cycle is forgotten when the next thing comes out. People forget that the same cycle repeats itself over and over again. I mean, did I ever tell you? We don't need to indulge one of the... I'm not even sure that that's the real definition of insanity, frankly. I like Voss's speech, though. I don't know how much I like it when anybody else says that phrase. There are more challenges that come with writing an Obi-Wan show than any other piece of Star Wars material, in that it is both a prequel to the OT and a sequel to the prequels. It is bound on both sides. It must adhere to what came before and after. That's hard. It's harder than writing a sequel. It's harder than writing a prequel. There's just more variables you need to account for. There's a lot more content that is going to inform your options narratively. Any new material can serve to recontextualize existing story beats, which is a double-edged sword, really. You can either enhance or damage what exists. This is the great potential, but also the great danger that comes with writing any additional story, really, to the story that you've already created. I think prequels and sequels run the risk of either making better what came before or damaging what came before. I think there's always a capacity to fix material that exists, to find ways to take material that wasn't good and to find some way to create something really good from it. There are a few examples of this. Angel season 5. I didn't watch seasons 2 or 3 of Stranger Things, but I have watched season 4, and so far it's pretty cool. Quite excited for the finale. I only watched season 1 and then jumped to 4 because everybody said not to watch 2 and 3. And from what I've heard, the show does a lot to rehabilitate the story that they were telling. That for all of the problems of 2 or 3, 4 kind of doesn't exist without them, but kind of moves past them and then ends up in a really good place. It can be done, you can... I think there's always... It just becomes harder to rehabilitate your story. And I mean, what we're left with Star Wars now is a pretty damaged story. You think about the number of good stories versus the number of bad stories. Not a good ratio, frankly. And the ratio will keep getting worse when opportunities that exist in this IP are not thoughtfully pursued. You look at Obi-Wan and the story that it tries to tell. Some existing story beats don't need to be expanded or recontextualized. It's important to consider what events are likely to have taken place during a particular time in a character's life. In the case of Obi-Wan, it's likely that very little happened. But the writers couldn't help themselves. They wanted Darth Vader. And you know what? Maybe the fans couldn't help themselves, because I think it is fair to say that a lot of people may not have liked this show at all without any references to Darth Vader or the prequels directly, or the OT. How easy is it to market your exciting Star Wars story if it's only going to be on Tatooine, which, it's the thing I've complained about plenty with the other Star Wars shows, but in this case it calls for it. A story where you don't have 2 studio mandated, I presume, action scenes per episode. A story that doesn't really see you go many places or do many crazy things, just focuses on characters dealing with what's troubling them. And in the case of Obi-Wan, you got a lot of potential there. Why don't we explore how Obi-Wan feels about the role that he played in the fall of Anakin Skywalker, his faith in the Jedi Order and the Code, what value he thinks it has when it, as far as he could tell at that point in time, kind of failed the galaxy. What ought he do? It would be great to see him grapple with these quandaries without, frankly, a pretty disconnected plot getting in the way. because the plot of this story doesn't really have a lot to do with Obi-Wan or his central mission at all. It kinda does at the end through remarkable contrivances, really. Man, good thing Haja dropped the little, recording that Bale sent to a presumed captured Obi-Wan Kenobi. Oh yeah, I'm gonna go to Tatooine to talk to Owen. Oh, Owen! The person that, Reva met when she went to Tatooine, the planet of Tatooine, and bumped into while she was there, enabling us to have an action scene that, I don't know, it's pretty close to Han Solo dropping Cthulhu into a black hole in terms of my ability to believe that it really happened. But that's like the only thing that really connects Obi-Wan Kenobi to his main mission, which was protecting Luke and ensuring that he can become a Jedi in the future. Otherwise, it's entirely disconnected. And in terms of drawing a parallel of Obi-Wan realizing his potential for good, I just don't think it's really there. I don't think it's very strong, thematically anyway. It really seems to me that the people who made this show didn't care how well it slots into the timeline, because it really doesn't. Many existing beats make less sense now. I saw on Twitter the scene when, in A New Hope, when Luke, rescues Leia and says, "I've come to rescue you, I'm here with Ben Kenobi," and Leia gets up and is like, "Ben Kenobi, where is he?" A lot of people have said, "Oh, well, this hits differently now," all the while ignoring that she doesn't seem to care that much when Obi-Wan dies, when she's comforting Luke while they're flying away on the Millennium Falcon. I would say that that is downright incongruent now, given the history that these two have. Whatever throwaway lines have been added to justify why Leia conveyed her message to Obi-Wan as she did with R2-D2, that line still doesn't account for why, right after his death, in the privacy of the Millennium Falcon, she doesn't seem to care. The reason why is because they probably didn't have a history. She probably knew who he was. It was probably exactly as the message went. She knew him because he knew Bale. You always run the risk of creating these incongruent moments when writing a prequel, and it just doesn't seem like anybody particularly cares, which is really lame. And speaking of missed opportunities again, you know, Qui-Gon showing up at the very end to say, "Hey, alright, let's go walk off into the desert." What was that? Why didn't he give, like, the pep talk? You know, "Hey, I know you're down." Come to him in his moment of crisis, Obi-Wan's moment of crisis, sit down next to him and say, "Hey man, you know, we all make mistakes. It's not your fault, though. You gotta get up. You gotta continue with your mission. You gotta save the day." You know, leveraging him in a moment that is narratively important. You know, having him be a character in the story rather than just showing up at the end to, I presume, if not, just be a cameo to tease a viable season 2. I mean, I wouldn't rule it out, guys. I would have a little while ago, but highest rated show on Disney Plus in terms of viewership. Why didn't he kill Darth Vader? Think about that entire scene, which I imagine is the scene that is praised the most in this show. Obi-Wan lures Darth Vader to a planet to have a fight with him, and then upon beating him through a second wind that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, he manages to land a blow that reveals Anakin's face. Obi-Wan says, "I'm sorry," and then Darth Vader retorts, "Obi-Wan didn't, kill Anakin Skywalker, I did." At which point, Obi-Wan immediately writes off the idea that Anakin is still in there, says that his friend is dead, and then says, "Goodbye, Darth." Putting to one side, jumping from, "I'm sorry, my friend, I want to help you," to, "No, my friend's dead, you're a lost cause," which he already thought in episode 3, but to jump from there to there, let's ignore how absurd that is, really, for Obi-Wan. You believe that you are looking at Darth Vader, a monster, not your friend, and you reveal this in no uncertain terms to the viewer by saying, "Goodbye, Darth." I presume this is the show's attempt to explain why he calls him Darth in A New Hope. But think about that. You are Darth Vader. You are not Anakin Skywalker, my friend, whom I care for. You are a different entity of evil. See ya and leave to allow Darth Vader to continue to inflict harm upon innocent people across the galaxy. Because you couldn't resist having an action scene between these two while being bound by the reality that Darth Vader exists in the original trilogy. It doesn't work. It cannot work. It is entirely incongruent with itself. It makes no sense why he would leave him there, based on what he himself explicitly said. This is just really bad writing, and it's writing that is entirely beholden to objectives that aren't strictly narrative. Objectives like, we want to fight between Obi-Wan and Darth Vader. A fight that, before this show existed, you can easily and very correctly believe never happened. That they fought on Mustafar and they never saw each other for 19 years until they met again on the Death Star. But now you have this sludge wedged in, squeezed in, shoving your shoulder against the hole in the wall as you're compressing the sludge into the timeline where it doesn't fit. And unfortunately in the process, the sludge spreads all over everything that surrounds it. And that's just one of a few problems with that whole sequence. Have you come here to destroy me? Says Darth Vader, who followed Obi-Wan to the planet and allowed the proto-rebels to escape because he just had to settle his petty feud with Obi-Wan with the entire Star Destroyer coming along with him instead of just getting into his own personal TIE fighter and flying over there like he did anyway. In the episode. And how did Obi-Wan escape from the planet when there was a Star Destroyer in orbit? How did he get to Tatooine so quickly? This universe is so small. This galaxy is so small now. Say what you will about the prequels, but the prequels blew the doors open on the sheer breadth of this galaxy. Here's something that I was feeling while watching the show that I get the same impression for while watching Andor, the trailer for Andor, and thinking about the entire Disney Star Wars tenure. Where are the fucking aliens? Where are the aliens? Why is it always people? You might occasionally get a droid, but there are no aliens who are main characters at all. It's always about people in this science fiction world. Maybe Taika Waititi will have the main character be an alien. If anybody was going to do it, I guess it would probably be him. Look into the future. You think about the upcoming Star Wars projects. I guess Taika Waititi's one is that's still kind of, it's 50-50 for me. It might nudge one way or the other depending on what I think about Thor Love and Thunder, which is out very soon. But otherwise, Andor strikes me as the only upcoming Star Wars project with a real chance of being good. I'm tired of Star Wars stories revolving around a handful of characters. This galaxy is vast and ripe for further exploration beyond the Skywalkers. Andor looks like it may explore this, and that alone is more interesting to me than any of the other projects that it seems that we've got coming up so far. It's the same reason why Skeleton Crew also kind of intrigues me, not just because it's John Watts. I love how that's controversial. I actually like John Watts' output and seeming eye for storytelling. But that's another one that seems to be disconnected from the main the main story. It feels like we've got more potential there, more freedom to do interesting things, that more original ideas may just stem from that realm. The only place that I think right now I can look to Star Wars with any level of, not optimism, but a level of interest is in any idea that is at least marginally risky. Andor seems a bit risky to me. Making a show about, let's be real, right? A character that didn't make that much of an impression on anybody when he first showed up. Exploring the seeming gray area of the conflict between the Rebels and the Empire. Its genre is meant to be a spy thriller, right? Or some sort of thriller series. That's kind of unique for Star Wars. It seems to have a writing team of more pedigree as well. Yeah, those things leave you a little bit more optimistic. Though maybe optimistic is a strong word. And same for Skeleton Crew as well. That one leaves me more optimistic too. But otherwise, Ahsoka, I don't know, what else? Rogue Squadron's probably not happening, is it? And even if it was, it'd just be nice to be able to get excited for Star Wars content. But how many times have we been burned by this era of Star Wars? The sequels, Mandalorian. God damn, Mandalorian could have been so cool. That premise could have been so awesome. Book of Boba Fett, now Obi-Wan. Obi-Wan was quite painful. Boba Fett was funny, but Obi-Wan was painful. Top Gun Maverick is now the highest grossing film of 2022 so far. This is very interesting. I'm sure I even said it on an episode of the show, but you asked me, a couple of months ago, I would have figured that Doctor Strange or another Marvel movie was sure to claim that title. To see a conventional action film rake in so much money and beat out, like, a Marvel movie that's trying to leverage being part of the multiverse, that's a real surprise, and not a totally unwelcome one. I'm not sure how much I want to talk about because I've seen Top Gun Maverick, but I'm not sure how much I really want to talk about that film, because I'm not sure how much there is for me to really say about it. It would seem that I have a lower opinion of that film than most people. I enjoyed it, for the most part, but besides the action, which I take a lot of issue with in Act 3, like, as far as I'm concerned, Act 3 deals a lot of damage to that film. When we talk about the sheer number of, 1 second later, and the main characters would have been killed, like that over and over and over again, and just these really fortunate circumstances lining up to protect our protagonists. Like, it feels like the world contorts around ensuring that the main characters achieve their objectives and win, which is not super satisfying to me, especially when I was really enjoying the story's build up of this is a really challenging mission that is gonna put an insane amount of stress on these incredibly talented pilots. But yeah, I don't know how much I want to go into that. I mean, but otherwise, right, it's a very normal film. I think that would be the easiest way to describe that film. It's very conventional. It's not narratively ambitious. Besides one scene, which I think was great, which I think everybody who's seen the film knows what I'm talking about. There's one scene in particular that I was really impressed by, but otherwise I wouldn't describe any of the character work as great. But I wouldn't describe it as deficient either. It works, which in the landscape that we're in right now, that alone seems to be an accomplishment. Having your characters, make decisions that are in character and go through an arc that makes sense, even if it's not hugely ambitious or complex or anything. Like, if you can achieve that alone, you're already doing alright. And it seems to reflect in, I think that's the reason why that film has received such a good reaction, is because on that front, it's working. I don't think it's working exceptionally well, but it's working, and that's something. I think people are in some ways receptive to these breaches of character. It just may be that sometimes you really need it to be significant before it gets broadly recognized. I mean, Game of Thrones, right? That's a pretty clear example of the entire sort of viewer base recognizing that breach. And so I think it's the reason why you can have something like Top Gun that is very straightforward, but it's not broken in terms of its characters, so it's easy to enjoy. It's a film which reminds me of the blockbusters we used to see before Marvel utterly took over. The better ones. Though, like I said, I think that film does have problems. I wouldn't say that a sequel to Top Gun being the highest grossing film of the year is a fantastic sign, but it's preferable to another fucking Marvel or Disney film claiming that spot. It really is. I didn't see this outcome coming. I guess, because from what I understand, Tom Cruise pushed for this film to get released in theaters, which I'm sure Paramount are very happy that they made that choice. I think it's the highest grossing film of his career now. And I guess looking at the rest of the year, I'm not even sure what would knock it off of that top spot. Especially since the film seems to still be making money. Apparently it's the 5th highest grossing film of all time in Australia as well. These unexpected outcomes, but again, it's preferable to to just more content sludge. I wonder, this is something that people are gonna take notice of, surely. I doubt it was in anybody's expectations that Top Gun would claim the top spot. Frankly, it wasn't in my expectations that, like, Doctor Strange would actually beat out the Batman, but, you know. And I guess looking to the future, it's a matter of what other films do you expect to compete with Top Gun in terms of taking that top spot. Thor, probably, is a real competitor. Black Panther 2, that's probably got a real chance. It's hard to say, right? Avatar 2, maybe. Maybe. I'm so curious to see how that film performs and whether or not that film is good. Avatar 2 still perplexes me. James Cameron clearly has an idea there for a story that he wants to tell. Top Gun is still what I think you could class as an IP film. I mean, you would have to. It is. Top Gun is an intellectual... It's more than just the one film now, right? It is a franchise in a sense, as opposed to a wholly original film, which, when was the last time that a wholly original film was, like, number one at the box office? Avatar, maybe? Maybe, actually. It's preferable to what, if you would asked me, even as recently as, like, 2 months ago, a very concerning sign in terms of the interests of the market in mainly these, like, IP films rather than anything that is even marginally different from that. Which I think Top Gun counts, even though it is, you know, a sequel to a film that has, you know, a reputation. Like, it's not an unknown film. In large part for me, what makes it preferable is the craft behind it. Top Gun is a film that, through its action mainly, there is a vision there in terms of an experience that it wants to deliver with really cool cinematography by way of, like, the cockpit shots and all of the, you know, like, it's got a style there, even if it's not a style that is as pronounced as you would see in, I don't know, like an Edgar Wright film. There is a style there and a craftsmanship that's worth appreciating, especially in a landscape that, like, I don't know, these Marvel films are starting to look worse. They're starting to look, like, kind of ugly. When you talk about not even just the visual effects, but in terms of the way that these films are shot, it's really starting to feel like a production line rather than like I don't know, like a piece of art, you know, rather than something that is trying to achieve a certain look and evoke certain feelings through the use of film as a visual medium, because of course it is a visual medium and the writing is the story at the end of the day. But I do like to see that thoughtfulness in the filmmaking, and also films that just don't look like shit. It's getting really bad when we talk about bad compositing, especially because nothing is real in Marvel movies. They never shoot on location, ever. It's always green screen, even when it's like a field or a forest. So yeah, in that sense, I'm happy that Top Gun has taken the top spot. And I wonder if the industry is going to take heed of this and what changes it may lead to in terms of the films that we start seeing come out more frequently over the next few years. I didn't expect Lightyear to bomb either, by the way. I was not expecting that. I guess I wasn't expecting it to do as well as the mainline Toy Story films, which, like, Toy Story 3 and 4 made $1 billion, didn't they? But I mean, Lightyear, oof. And Lightyear is the first theatrical release for a Pixar film. The last few have been straight to Disney+. I wonder what the state of Pixar is right now. Like, I wonder where they sit on the totem pole when, for like a good 15 years, more than that even maybe, Pixar were like the top dog of Disney animation, more so than like more so than Disney Animation Studios. Seems to be flipping. Not necessarily flipping based on, because I haven't watched a lot of these films. I don't know if it's like flipping based on their quality or just which ones have got like broader market appeal. Whether or not there's even like a substantial difference in terms of the talent at both studios. Talent technologically and from an art perspective. I wonder if it says something about, well, I don't even know if I wonder. I think it does say something about Disney's priorities that all of the Pixar films that ended up on Disney Plus were original. It was Soul, Luca, and Turning Red, and I think Onward ended up on there. Though I guess I won't count that. Like Soul, Luca, and Turning Red, all three of these are original, which is something that Pixar used to make a lot more original films. And Lightyear is, it's Toy Story, essentially. And it's not doing so well. And I guess it's hard to think about how well those other films would have done if they were released theatrically. We seem to have very much come out of the COVID era when it comes to box office and a substantial impact on box office numbers. If you imagine a landscape where, I don't know, these films came out in normal times and then you can see how much money they make, I wonder if those films would have done better. Having spent the last few weeks undertaking a more focused art regiment, I've come to really enjoy creating pixel art. I've still got a lot to learn, but I'd like to discuss what I've learned so far because it's been interesting, in my opinion. I think my interest in learning about pixel art was, I'm not even sure where it arose from. I just think it's a cool style. It always has. Though to say it's a style is kind of reductive because there's a lot of styles within the style. But I'm not sure where it arose from originally. But because I think I dabbled with it a while ago. Then I stopped. I mean, of course, I dabbled with the pixel art to make the Cosmoronic art you're looking at right now. But I found it quite challenging. And still do, really. I think what was confounding me at first was the process of creating something. Like, if you just draw something, like in an art program, like an illustration, you do, like, your construction, and then you build it up with more, like, detailed sketches, and then keep building it up until you end up with your finished piece, making revisions and tweaks and stuff along the way. But I guess starting with your base, you could start with your construction lines and whatnot to sort of figure out what you're creating and how it looks, depth or anything, like how much volume or just posing or anything like that. It's a little bit different though with pixel art because it's just a limited space to work in, and what is more important to achieve through that medium, I don't know if I'd say inherently, because I don't think I know enough to actually say something that definitive, but in my experience differs from the way that you need to think about it through more traditional means. Everything I'm about to say, by the way, just qualify it with, or like begin the sentence in your head with, in Fringy's opinion. So, in my opinion, pixel art is about limitations. It's about what's essential. There are so many questions to consider when you're like making something. What ought you do with a small space you have to work with? What is absolutely essential? What elements are most important? Is it worth dedicating space to this element of the piece rather than another element? The limited amount of space means that you just need to, you can't. Superfluous elements are hard to justify and hard to even make work because you just don't have a lot of space to work with. If every pixel is visible on what you've created, which I think you would say is essentially what differentiates pixel art from more traditional art, is that you can literally see each pixel, each block. I guess you imagine it this way. I don't know, you got a character who's got a face, and I don't know, the face fits into an 8x8 space, which I think is actually kind of large for most pixel art. If you only have 8 horizontal and 8 vertical spaces to work with, that's not a lot of space to fit in, like, eyes, mouth, ears, hair, and certainly not enough space to add in like really minute details in a lot of cases. And so you need to be more deliberate in choosing what elements to incorporate into whatever piece you're working on. It needs to be essential to communicating important attributes of a character or a space. And it leaves you in a position where one ill-placed pixel can just throw what you're making off in a way that is, I don't even know if that's really a thing that can happen, where like a misplaced pixel on a 2000 by 2000, illustration can throw somebody off because it's just too small a detail. By working within such a small palette, within such a small space rather, you have to pick your battles. You know, you can't be superfluous with details. Every pixel matters. That's really fun to me, or at least it has been so far. I think it's forcing me to reconsider my approach. Again, this is all framed through the perspective of somebody who feels that he has a hell of a lot to learn about all art disciplines in general, and a lot of room to improve. But I think it seems to me like it's been good to have to think about how to make something differently, because it just draws your attention to different aspects of, I guess, what you would broadly call visual communication. Something that's particularly pronounced, and I think it always has been with video games when you think about the gameplay aspect of that experience, silhouettes. There was a video that was released like around the release of Team Fortress 2 where it was either the art director or someone who worked on that game was talking about how they spent a long time figuring out how do we create a game that has, 9 playable characters where people can identify who is who at a glance so that they know how to react to, any given enemy. An important way of communicating that is through silhouettes. If the character has a distinctive silhouette, that'll be the first thing that your mind registers. So you see Spy is very, slender, tall, compared to the Heavy, who's bulking, compared to Demo Man, who's got more bulky equipment on him, or the problem is I'm trying to think about which aspects. This is what I mean. It's you don't even need to be able to identify the aspects. You don't even have to be aware specifically of what part helping you differentiate these characters. You just pick up on it straight away when you see their silhouette. And it seems like with pixel art, a silhouette can be incredibly helpful to start with, more so than, or maybe not more so, but as much as a preliminary sketch. If the silhouette works, then whatever design you come up with will probably work within those confines. It's a great place to start with, but it's not a place that I have typically started with while doing illustration. And I wonder if maybe I will try more to consider blocking as part of this, I guess more, because I've got the book in front of me. I've had this book for ages, Figure Drawing, Design and Invention. I really should have read this fully when I got it, because I've got so many useful, it's fantastic in terms of a breakdown of approaching drawing people and thinking about the component pieces of, building them up from construction lines, how to think about the head and what basic shapes you're working with. The usefulness of basic shapes in general and constructing everything that, anything you could really think of, no matter how complex it comes across as a physical object or a being, can be broken down into, shapes, spheres, squares, no, not squares, spheres, cubes, pyramids. I'm finding it interesting to think about how that can apply to a pixel art character, creating depth in a space that is, at least when you think about it in the video game world, distinctly two-dimensional, and to create depth in characters through shading and how should you use outlines. And then even stuff that you wouldn't even think about, something that I've learned a lot about, the nature of Jaggies. Jaggies being when a line or a curve in pixel art is broken by inconsistent placement of pixels. So for instance, if you were drawing a straight line, should be 1 pixel diagonally. If you were doing a diagonal line, 1 pixel and a pixel in the top left pixel, and then so on and so forth. And that can be broken if you have a part where it's just got 2 pixels rather than 1, or in a curve when you don't have a smooth shift. So, I don't know, you go from 1 to 3 to 2 to 5 instead of 1, and then 2 pixels, and then 3, and then 4, and, then back to 3, 2, 1. These are just things that you don't really need to think about, in my experience, when I'm just doing more traditional art. And that's really fun as a different challenge. Figuring out what styles exist within the style, too. The difference between working with a 16 by 16 canvas versus 32 by 32 versus 64 by 64, and I think it's not unrealistic or uncommon to push it even further, that 128 by 128, even understanding that it should be broken down in that way, always multiplying, something you're aware of with 8 16-bit, 32-bit, but not necessarily considering the reasons why. It's a new frontier for me, and I'm still very much a novice, but damn, have I been having a lot of fun with pixel art. I really like the quick turnaround, though. Maybe that really means I really have a lot left to learn about that medium. Maybe I should be spending longer on that. I like the limitations. I like how it forces me to be more deliberate and recognize the importance of minor components of the seemingly insignificant parts of a piece that you're working on. It's helping me think about art differently and in a way that I hope will and is improving my illustrations. I still got a long way to go, but when I'm having fun with it, when I'm having consistently a lot of fun with it, that makes it a lot easier to keep pushing onward. And so I shall. I've been thinking about ludonarrative dissonance lately, and I'd like to share those thoughts with you, because it's a topic I find fascinating. It's worthy of an in-depth video someday, but a semi-structured ramble will have to suffice for now. So what is ludonarrative dissonance? As I understand it, it is essentially the conflict between the narrative as told through cutscenes and gameplay. It describes a disconnect between the gameplay and the story. So you would think about it like this, that there is a story that is being told to you through the cutscenes that doesn't seem to align with the story that you will be pulling out of the gameplay. There is just a disconnect there, where the story and the gameplay don't synergize. Games which try to tell more involved stories are just more likely to suffer from dissonance, I think. You look at Mario. Mario tells such a simple story that the gameplay is never really in a position to conflict with it. Peach gets kidnapped by Bowser and Koopa and Goomba army and whatnot. Go save her. Go jump on those Goombas and Koopas and go save Princess Peach. There's not really any room for a wedge to form between the gameplay and the story, mainly because the story is virtually non-existent, and only exists to service the gameplay, to set Mario off on his adventure. Conversely, narrative-driven games, like basically the entirety of Naughty Dog's output since Uncharted 1, Tomb Raider 2013, Mass Effect and whatnot, are more prone to dissonance, especially given that all of these games revolve around combat. It is the most often cited example, I think, of ludonarrative dissonance, but that's because it's such a good one. Tomb Raider 2013 puts Lara Croft in a situation where she is forced to kill people to survive, and the first person that she kills, it's very traumatic for her in cutscenes. She really struggles to deal with it. But then the gameplay starts up, and we got combat, and so Lara is now fighting these people who are attacking her and killing them, and because it's gameplay, it's just you doing it, like, pretty effortlessly. And the only attempt that they really have to try and, just, like, mitigate the pretty clear disconnect, is her going, "Oh, I'm sorry. It's just something's not working. There is a disconnect between what you were telling me is happening with this character and what is actually happening as part of the gameplay." And so you might be left thinking, like, so it's combat, right? Combat is the problem. But, combat as a core gameplay mechanic, I don't think necessitates dissonance. Action games and first-person shooters don't often have this problem. There's no dissonance between the story of Doom 2016 and the gameplay, because the story is entirely in service of the gameplay. You are Doomslayer, there's a bunch of demons, kill them. There's no room for a wedge to form there between the player's understanding of the story as told through cutscenes versus gameplay. I guess that's at the root of it there, though, is the wedge between the player and the player character, I think, is what is at the heart of ludonarrative dissonance. I don't imagine that there's ever ludonarrative dissonance in Tetris, because there is no player character. It's you. There are no characters. There is no story. So I've just stumbled across a really profound observation. Ludonarrative dissonance, which describes narrative disconnects, doesn't exist in games with no narrative. But I guess it's worth pointing out in terms of highlighting what is at the core. I don't even know if it's like narrative. I think you can have a narrative that exists because of... I think you can have a narrative that exists devoid of clearly defined characters in a video game, just based on, like, objectives that you are working to achieve. Like, if you're playing Civilization, there are characters, right? They're the people, like the world leaders that are in charge of the civilizations. Like, you are that character, and the story is about you trying to win this game of Civilization and achieve some broad objective, whether it's like military victory, science victory, culture victory. And you could say that's the narrative, but there's nothing that could really exist to cause a disconnect there either, because it's just gameplay that's telling a story, in a sense. And so, see, right now, you can hear my mind trying to figure out what the link is there, because there's something there that I'm just trying to figure out exactly what it is and explain it in words that I think is important to this discussion. The types of disconnects that can exist between gameplay and story are not... They vary. It's not as simple as the story telling you that the character you're playing at has X attributes, and then the character having Y attributes while playing the game in terms of their beliefs or the way that they conduct themselves or the things that they do. Because, I think Ludonarrative Dissonance also stems from, it also stems from what the capacity of a character is in gameplay versus in cutscenes. I mean, a pretty obvious example of this is there will be often moments in Uncharted where you're surrounded by 5 guys. It's like, drop your weapons, guys, we got you surrounded. And in cutscenes, they'll drop those weapons when, if it were gameplay, you could take on those 5 guys. The capacity that the character has in cutscenes and gameplay doesn't match. So it can extend beyond the more, I guess, obvious example of Nathan Drake is a wise guy, a hero guy. Like, he's a hero man. Meanwhile, in gameplay, he's just, like, massacring all of these other people who are coming up against him. That there's, like, a clear disconnect narratively there that you just kind of have to look past in order to engage with the story. I guess another disconnect would be Nathan Drake is a normal guy capable of achieving unbelievable feats, for as much as the game tries to humanize him through the animation. There's a lot of games that have that, though, where the capacity of the character you're playing as does not match what they're capable of. But meanwhile, you can have examples of games that completely avoid that. Like Hotline Miami is a good example. You are as strong as the enemies that you come up against. The edge you have over them is what you as the player are able to achieve through how you play, rather than being bestowed more health than the enemies that you're fighting. Or alternatively, if you've got like a strict action game, you think like Devil May Cry or something, where you get put up against a boss who has a hell of a lot more health than you, and so it comes down to your prowess in combat, like how you defeat them, in action games like Metal Gear Rising, Bayonetta, and whatnot. Hence why I think the action games, like strict action games like that, don't typically run into this problem. But I guess we can't really go much further with the discussion without, I guess, touching on this point. How important is ludonarrative dissonance, really? What the narrative goals of games be? Should these goals be pursued in the face of a potential disconnect between story and gameplay? Or, in other words, is ludonarrative dissonance a flaw? I think I'm happy to bite the bullet and say it is. Ludonarrative dissonance is the product of contradiction. It's akin to what happens when one's suspension of disbelief snaps. And I don't know that it's good enough to say, well, I have a story that I want to tell, so who gives a shit? Because that's essentially the problem The Last of Us 2 has. The feelings that the player has, and the feelings that are, in a certain sense, facilitated and propagated by the gameplay, are entirely mismatched with the point that the developers want to make. The problem is, your point fails in that regard for most people. So and it stems from the disconnect between the gameplay and the story. The disconnect in this case being that it kind of rings hollow to have the message "revenge is bad" stem from Ellie letting Abby go after killing many people who didn't even wrong her in this deeply personal way that is in gameplay, that the story just doesn't want to acknowledge. It doesn't make sense, and it stems from a game where you have to fight people. Though I guess in that case, I don't even know if that's ludonarrative dissonance. That might just be like just plain bad writing. I don't think it's good enough to say, well, this is the story I wanted to tell, so don't think about what the gameplay says, because the gameplay is the larger portion of the experience in most games. It is an entirely valid and important part of the experience that I don't think can be ignored, and that I don't know that I would praise a game for forcing you to ignore. Surely it would be worthy of a lot more praise if the gameplay and the story synergize, and there is no disconnect, and the gameplay even enhances the narrative, which is the case in a lot of really great, or in the very least, games that I'm more interested in, as video games intrinsically. But I guess here's another question worth considering. Does a narrative flaw have any bearing on the gameplay? Can a storytelling flaw really bleed into the overall design of a given game? What does inconsistency in this storytelling mean in terms of the quality of the gameplay? Like, can you impugn the gameplay because of the story? That's interesting to me, because I think the gut reaction would be no, and yet I'm still sort of pondering that. I think you can essentially analyze gameplay in isolation, but can you analyze design in isolation? Like, if we talk about game design broadly, surely we would say that game design broadly can feature narrative elements. For instance, I would say that if you're making... I mean, it's pretty typical. Stealth games are really good often with environmental storytelling, where the story comes through in the level that you're exploring. And I would say that that is a fusion of level design and narrative design to make a play space that is fun to interact with, but makes sense given the location it is in the story and contains elements that tell you the story in logical places. I would say that that is a fusion of narrative and, or more so that game design in that case is incorporating narrative. And I think you could happily say that a disconnect there in that design would be a flaw that impugns the, I guess, broadly what you would consider gameplay. Like, let's say, I don't know, you're in the area is supposed to be a train station, but the way that it is designed is not even like what you see in most cases, where you try and push what you can get away with in a given location, that you try to justify the level design as much as possible in this space to make sure it's fun but not causing problems with how you perceive it, versus if it is entirely an illogical layout for the place that you were supposed to be in. I would say that that's a flaw, and I would say that that would be a flaw that does, in some sense, even if it's in a minor sense, impugn the narrative. Now, this may seem like a needless tangent, and maybe it is, but I'm just thinking about what that says for the nature of the importance of gameplay and story working in tandem and not being considered two fundamentally different things. If what you present through gameplay, whether accidentally or purposefully in terms of narrative, is inconsistent in any way with any other part of your game story, whether interactive or not, I think that would have to be considered a flaw, in which case, you know, is it a flaw storytelling-wise that the story that Uncharted tells in cutscenes, for as entertaining as it is, at points in particular, really doesn't align with what the gameplay presents? I don't have an answer for that. I guess I'm just thinking about it. But this leads us to the part that is most interesting to me right now about this topic. I would like to make a video game one day, and something which fascinates me and kind of inspires me to want to do it is the question of how gameplay can tell a story. How does one synergize gameplay and story? Should the story be shaped by the mechanics or vice versa? I think there are both overt and subtle ways of aligning the interests of the player and the player character, which is kind of where I'm at right now when thinking about this. When there is a disconnect between what the player wants and what the player character once, I think it can cause problems. Again, The Last of Us 2 is a clear example. It would have been interesting if Naughty Dog provided players with the choice that they could make Ellie's choice on whether to spare or kill Abby, and to see how many people would have picked either of those options, and if the majority of people would have picked killing her, which I think that would have been the majority choice by players. By having Ellie not make that choice, a choice that is confusing to a good number of people, that disconnect between what the player wants and what the player character wants. Is there something valuable to be extracted from that gap in terms of narrative or theme? Or is it better, strictly, to have the interests of the player and the player character aligned and facilitated through gameplay? Halo is a strong example. You are cast as Master Chief, a character who is not quite a blank slate, but pretty close to it, whose only discernible goals are really to do what you would want to do, which is to fight the Covenant, save the day. There's never a time when what you will need to do in the gameplay as Master Chief is something that you don't want to do. There's no disconnect there. And I think the same applies a lot of the time for silent protagonists. You know, it's like in Breath of the Wild, I guess you could point to the dissonance that often exists in like open world games of, here's an urgent quest, but you can kind of do whatever you want. But nevertheless, like, there's never anything that Link does that isn't something you would do, because what Link does is what you do. He doesn't have any goals beyond the goals that you have, which is to essentially complete the mission that you've been tasked with. That is the straightforward way, I would say, of ensuring that the player's interests and the character's interests are aligned. But I think we can explore it a little bit further. You know, there's got to be more to it than that, than having somebody who isn't really a character at all. Like, what are the methods at the disposal of developers with a story that does exist and a character that is defined that has certain goals in mind? This is getting to be a confusing sentence. Let's start again. Let's say you are creating a story that does have a character who has wants and fears and is embarking on some sort of objective. There is a story here beyond just, I don't know, go fight the bad guys. When we have such a character, can we use gameplay to subtly align the interests of the player with this character? Can the game be designed in such a way that it can instill the player with the same emotions the player character is or would be feeling? Let's say that we have a scenario where we force the player to contend with an intense challenge, and in narrative, this is an intense challenge for the player character. The triumph of overcoming these odds may be as potent for the player as they would be for the player character. The narrative triumph, the feeling of success that you have is the same as that your player character has. Think about something like Papers, Please, which I think is a really strong example of blending narrative and gameplay. So in Papers, Please, you play as a border security agent in a nondescript Eastern European country. And the gameplay is checking people's papers, admitting the people who have the right papers, and sending away the people who don't have the right papers. And the objective is essentially to take care of your family. You take care of your family by making money, you make money by correctly doing your job. There's an incentive to be quick, because the more people you get through, the more money you make and the safer your family is. You can take care of them when they get sick, make sure they get enough food. Pretty straightforward. One of the interesting things that you have there is that the tension that you have in knowing that you need to be quick in order to make money matters not only narratively for the character, because in narrative, the character needs to do this to make money to take care of his family, but you, just as a player, if you want to succeed from a gameplay perspective, which, you know, pretty much everybody who plays a game wants to do, you're also going to feel that tension of trying to get through as quickly as possible. You're aligning the interests of the player and the player character, and then when that game starts to do what it's really known for, the interesting aspect of that game, when someone will come up to you and there is a narrative around them that is influenced by your decision to let them through or turn them away that may or may not be important to the broader story, but, you know, you can be presented with somebody who's like, I have the wrong papers, but please let me through. I'll be in danger if I don't get in. Do you want to take the risk of letting that person through, getting a citation, maybe not being able to make as much money, or not being afforded to make as many mistakes, that has a gameplay impact for you in terms of completing the game, but in universe would have an impact on the character that you're playing because of the consequences that will stem from that? You have a game where the core gameplay loop sees the narrative interests of the character aligned very well with the narrative with the interests of the player through intentional design of the gameplay. That's what I find interesting as the value of video games as a medium. What are the tools at your disposal to have the gameplay tell a story, and to have that story be so congruent within itself that the disconnect is very difficult to form between the player and the player character to achieve a sense of connection with the character that you're playing as that doesn't necessarily exist in any other medium of storytelling. That to me is super interesting. That idea of how can you synergize gameplay and narrative is like what is my interest in wanting to make video games. The reason why I like thinking about this, and part of why I'm talking about it, is in my own little way to try and nudge the conversation in that direction to utilize the interactive nature of video games. Games have a vast narrative potential which we haven't fully uncovered yet, and I think and hope these discussions can push us in the right direction, because the marriage of gameplay and story is a fascinating creative frontier, and I think we are still just scratching the surface of what video games, the breadth of the experiences that video games can offer narratively. There's a lot of great examples, and I think that we'll keep seeing more examples going forward as well. It's exciting, it's interesting, because video games are still, they're old, but they're also quite new. And especially in the indie space, you see a lot of this type of exploration of what you can do narratively with video games. Narratively in a way that is not at the expense of really fun gameplay mechanics either. I think that they can exist in tandem. If you have a story in mind, ought the gameplay be designed around that story to really prop it up? If your story has X character with X attributes that they would reasonably have, think about what mechanics or core gameplay loop you can design that would fully support that idea. Or alternatively, if you have a gameplay system in mind that you really want to tap into, instead of just doing whatever story you want, think about what kind of story would best integrate with the gameplay mechanics that you already have. That, to me, seems like the root of avoiding the disconnect between gameplay and narrative, by thinking about how they can be complementary rather than treating them as two different things. Like I said, the marriage of gameplay and story is a fascinating creative frontier, and I look forward to seeing what comes of it. And maybe in the future, I look forward to being able to, in some small way, contribute to that further exploration. But we'll have to just wait and see. Maybe I will actually learn how to code after the fourth or fifth attempt at it. That does it for me this week. Thank you very much for hanging out. This was Cosmoronic 16. I'm Fringy, and I'll catch you all next time.